Greece. It's given us so much: baklava, the Olympics, the Parthenons, olive oil, and of course, the origins of democracy. But Greece also gave us the first really big test of the Cold War. Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trio, and today we will take a look at our next topic in the Who Was to Blame for the Cold War. In our last focus point, we talked about how the Soviet Union began taking over Eastern Europe, and this focus point is essentially on how the United States reacts to that expansionism. In this presentation, we're going to focus on three separate themes. The first is known as the long telegraph, which was developed by a U.S. diplomat by the name of George Kennan. The second is the concept of containment. And then last but not least, we are going to talk about how the Soviets react to the U.S. moves. Now, when we look at the long telegraph, George Kennan is working on the ground in Russia and Lithuania, in Eastern Europe generally, and he comes up with a set of recommendations. And essentially he says to the president, Russia is hostile, and that essentially this goodwill that has been formed during the Second World War isn't going to last because Russia has its sights on expanding. He also makes a claim that communism by its very nature is chaotic, and that's one of the reasons why it can't be trusted. He also doesn't believe that peace is possible. He believes that the United States should follow a policy of containment, and we'll talk about the concept of containment next. And one of the most interesting observations that he makes way back in the 1940s is that the Soviet Union, in its present structure, cannot survive. In other words, the Soviet Union won't be able to sustain its expansion in Eastern Europe and keep the people happy in the long term. Now, what is this idea of containment that George Kennan was essentially proposing as the main policy for the United States? One analogy that I like to think of is the way that smoking is handled in many places around the world. There are places where you can smoke, and there are places where you can't smoke. Now, I think that we would all generally agree that smoking is bad for you, and that smoking can be very unhealthy. But why would a group of people essentially say, smoking is okay here, but not okay over there? Well, the idea of containment is essentially the same, in which you are telling the Soviet Union in a way that you can have your communism over there, but keep it over there and don't approach communism in the areas that we are interested in. So this essentially goes hand in hand with that idea of the spheres of influence that we talked about in our last focus point. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the first really big test for the Cold War was Greece. And one of the reasons is that Greece doesn't really fall into that area of Eastern Europe. However, the Soviet Union was essentially supporting communists in their overthrow of the Greek monarch. Great Britain had had a long tradition of supporting Greece, but in the years after the Second World War, essentially they weren't able to continue that financial or military support. And this is essentially where the United States stepped in. President Harry Truman saw the situation in Greece, and he felt like this was a red line, that the United States had to step in and help the Greeks, because if Greece falls to communism, well, their other ally, Turkey, which is in the same neighborhood, could also fall to communism. And then what next? France? Italy? Well, President Truman felt that this was where they need to stop communism in its tracks. And they're going to do this by essentially a twofold measure. The idea that had been proposed by George Kennan was containment. And containment could be essentially put in place with a two-armed strategy. The first is known as Truman Doctrine, and the second is the Marshall Aid Program. Let's talk about each of these specific policies. First, Truman guaranteed $400 million in military and economic support for Greece and Turkey. And more surprisingly, they essentially made a commitment, an open-ended commitment, that if these countries are attacked, the United States would support them. Now, this is vastly different, as you may remember from our previous chapters, in that the United States had traditionally been an isolationist nation, in which it kept that Atlantic Ocean between itself and the problems of Europe. But Harry Truman believed that essentially it was now time in this new world order that the United States takes the lead in promoting democracy. The second arm of containment was the Marshall Aid Program. This supported $13 billion in support to rebuild Europe in the years after the war. This was for refugees, this was for construction projects, this was for food. It was a substantial amount of money. And one of the things which was sort of the sore point, I suppose, is that it wasn't available to those nations which were controlled by the Soviet Union. So essentially, it was considered an extreme threat to the Soviets because words and actions, such as the ones that are made in the Truman Doctrine, are one thing, but hard cash on the barrel, giving it to people, well, Stalin felt that this was undermining his influence in Eastern Europe. When we look at the reaction of the Soviets in relation to the Marshall Aid Program, you could say that the money is like a gun, or more so, a bullet, which is being fired into Eastern Europe. It's a direct threat. And as a result, the Soviet Union puts up its guard. It uses organizations like its communist governments in Eastern Europe to block all support from the United States and its allies into Eastern Europe. And in many ways, Joseph Stalin tries to regain as much control of his support in the Eastern Bloc countries, specifically in Czechoslovakia, which up to this point had been somewhat weak. So what we see with the events of the Greek Civil War is the origins of where these two nations, the Soviet Union and the United States, are just not in ideological differences with each other, but here they're actively doing things in order to undermine the other. I hope that this video has been useful. There's a lot of information about the Truman Doctrine and a lot of information about the Marshall Aid that's available, so I hope you avail yourself to that, and we'll talk more in class.